And there's also a quote that you give from Rustin saying, if we only protest for concessions from without, then that party treats us the same way as any other conflicting pressure groups. That means it offers us the most minimum concessions for votes. But if the same amount of pressure is exerted from inside the party using highly sophisticated political tactics, we can change the structure of that party. I mean, that's basically, that's the pitch that he's making at that time.
Yep.
And so
that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, and so so part of what they were doing was to force this conflict that which was already sort of more than nascent, I guess, that at that point, to a head by compelling what they perceived was one half of the Democratic Party, but it actually was 2/3 of the Democratic Party, right? In accepting basically a broader emancipation for minorities.
Yep, absolutely. And like the business wing of the Democratic Party was pretty happy to go along with civil rights, you know? I mean, they had a much bigger agenda than what was happening in the South, right? Like this is the period where the U.S. is trying to win leadership over the decolonizing countries, and images of images of police brutality and anti-civil rights violence, the Klan, are being broadcast all over the world, while all these companies are trying to make connections in places like Africa and Asia. You know, they said this is way more trouble than it's worth. We are absolutely happy to back civil rights bills and the like.
And I mean, who were the figures? I mean, how was it still? But was it just that because these people were outsiders or at least marginal within the Democratic Party, that they just didn't have a consciousness of what was going on, on the, I don't know, the other side of the hill, essentially?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. None of these people were kind of in the top echelons of the Democratic Party where the decisions were being made. And it also wasn't broadly known that the Democratic Party had emerged like this through this alliance with really kind of the advanced sections of capital. Like that wasn't recognized anywhere really until like the 1970s and 80s, when like the political historian Thomas Ferguson did a tremendous amount of archival work in bringing this story to light. It wasn't something that was acknowledged really anywhere in American politics.
That's just fascinating to me. And I mean, what a huge blind spot. And I guess that's the point of your piece on some level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like for me, kind of the lesson of this history is both kind of looking back and being able to admire the kind of strategic thinking that they were able to deploy, while also recognizing that because of this blind spot, it was doomed from the beginning. And kind of being able to hold both those at once is, I think, one lesson that we can take from this.
I mean, how well, in hindsight, I guess it looks like it all went fairly smoothly, right? The strategy is we're going to cleave off the Dixiecrats, and on the day that Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, he says, "I think we've just lost the South for a generation." He was probably off by a couple of generations, but
yeah.
Was that? I mean, it basically. I mean, it seems like to the extent that they. Their plan may have been slightly ill-conceived in some respects, but it seems to have been executed exactly as planned.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly works better than most of what the American left has done for the last couple decades. You have to give that to them.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the real irony of it. It failed by succeeding.
Well, let's also talk about George Meany here too, because it also feels like there was I guess we have to keep in mind that when you're sitting down and looking at this plan, the implications of George Meany are less if you don't think that he has, I don't know if I would call them allies, but certainly people to his right, I guess we could say, in the business community on the same team. Like if you don't realize that that there's this other player, this shadow player there, then the implications of George Meany become, I guess diminished. But tell us who George Meany is, and tell us why he's relevant relative to other labor leaders.
So George Meany was the head of the AFL-CIO. And remember, the CIO had started as a split from the AFL in the 1930s, a kind of insurgent left-wing split. And in the 1950s, the two came back together to form a united federation that, kind of represented the end of the labor insurgency of the CIO. It was kind of reincorporated back into the reunited AFL-CIO, and Meany was the head of it. And Meany came out of the plumbers union and was a real bureaucrat. He bragged about having never walked a picket line in his life. He just totally dismissed the idea of organizing the unorganized workers. When asked about them, he'd say, that's our business as organized workers. They're not our constituency. If they want a voice, they can get themselves organized. Kind of a lot of things that I think for a lot of people on the left, the idea that this stuff would come from a labor leader seems totally counterintuitive. But this was actually, the dominant strain, the leadership of the American labor movement for much of the mid-20th century. And he was a vicious anti-communist. And radicals in the late 60s called the AFL-CIO the AFL-CIA, because of all its activities that went hand in hand with the CIA overseas, working against communist-led unions, that kind of thing. Meany was quite a nasty figure and absolutely an enemy of the left. But he was very powerful, right? He was the head of the AFL-CIO, and as such, he was the head of labor's political intervention in politics, which meant its support for the Democratic Party and its work within the Democratic Party. And so if your strategy is, we want to transform the Democratic Party into something like a social democratic party, which is, has a base in the union, you're going to be working really close with George Meany, and there's no way to get around that. And, Rustin and Shackman and people like that absolutely recognize that, and recognize that if their strategy was to work, they were going to have to be in a coalition with George Meany. And as the 60s went on, that coalition started to carry some real political costs.
And so how did that coalition carry those costs, and how was that coalition forged? I mean, did it mean, who was alienated in the context of that coalition?
Well, so the key kind of strain in that coalition was the development of the Vietnam War, which, in the early 60s was still not a major issue that was fracturing American politics, especially compared to civil rights. But as the 60s go on and the Vietnam War becomes more and more prominent and opposition to the war becomes, a bigger and bigger fact of American life on the American left, conflict with Meany starts to erupt. Because Meany was a diehard supporter of the war and a diehard supporter of the Johnson administration, both for reasons of his anti-communism and the war delivered a lot of paychecks to AFL-CIO workers in the defense industry, and Meany saw his job as protecting that. So he was a major supporter of the war, and so the realignment kind of tendency, the group essentially splits, and people like Rustin and Shackman go with Meany and say, we're with Meany, and they had different positions. Shackman was essentially pro-war. He had kind of moved steadily to the right as he became more and more anti-communist. Rustin, still was a pacifist in name, and was, did things like defend Martin Luther King when Martin Luther King spoke out against the war, and in private he said he was for a negotiated end to the war, but he, as a part of the coalition with Meany, he essentially spent most of his time in the mid to late 60s attacking the anti-war movement and saying they were pro-communist, all these kind of smears. Meanwhile, Michael Harrington and the people around him refused to go along with that essentially, and said we're not going to compromise ourselves by to maintain a coalition with Meany if that means basically uncritically backing the war. And Harrington certainly had his own conflicts with the New Left, and was in his actual position on the war was not very far from Rustin, but wasn't willing to kind of go whole hog in the coalition with Meany. And what that meant for the attitude towards the war.
So the splits that's created, some people go with Meany, and really the war becomes the defining factor in terms of what's drawing these lines. Is that what made it impossible to really reform the Democratic Party, insofar as like you had what people anticipated would be, again, without their knowledge of that third sort of element of the party, but even the two elements of the party were no longer were no longer on the same side of the divide anymore because of the existence of the war. And so what happens? I mean, the sort of that shadow partner, capital, begins to assert itself more in the party because now it's those two as opposed to the other two? I don't know. This feels like when my daughter has a play date on some level with two other friends. But invariably, that's what works out, right? Is like you got three players, two are going to hook up, and it turns out to be. Is that basically what happens at that point?
So, I mean, it certainly didn't help that, this kind of civil war breaks out in the realignment camp, but I don't think it was actually decisive. Because I think you could say there's kind of two episodes to realignment. The first one in the 60s that kind of ends with this strife over the Vietnam War, and then another one in the 70s with like McGovern and Carter that isn't essentially about the war. But I think you could say that this episode was ended by the war. But even if it hadn't been, I think it would have come to the same fate as the later episode. But so, like by the late 1960s, the question in the Democratic Party is no longer like, can this party be reformed to be a labor party? It's like, is there going to be an anti-war voice in the Democratic Party, and is the party going to be for the war or against it? Right. This is what all the Kennedy, McCarthy, McGovern's primary challenges to after Johnson said he wasn't going to run anymore. This is what they were all about. And so like the question of like how the Democratic Party needs to be changed shifts because of the war, and when it shifts, Shachtman and Rustin and Meany are all on the side of we want the party to stay as is. We don't want the party to change. And so, once that happens, you can't really call them partisans of realignment anymore. They're defending the party as it exists. Harrington and his group still wanted to change the party and wanted to change it into an anti-war party.
And nobody's even talking about that social democratic party anymore. And so then you go forward and we have McGovern now who has this cleave with the unions because they were supporting the war and my sense is too from what I've read other issues just broadly speaking his the reforms that come out of 68 end up undercutting the union power within the Democratic Party, because we now have primaries on some level, which again, I guess this third contingent. So, hello, you. I'm Sam Seder. Looking for smart progressive talk that is occasionally amusing? Well, subscribe to our YouTube feed. Subscribe to our podcast, like us on Facebook, and just generally enjoy us.